So we have the top of the skull, bottom of the chin, the back of the skull back here. We don't want to underestimate that. And we know roughly where the brow is landing, right through the pupils of the eyes. So from here, I want to think about the shapes of the eye sockets. You can see this right here. It almost looks like an upside down pair of sunglasses here too. So here from this 3/4 view, we can see how this angle of the eye socket here runs into that cheekbone right there. And here, especially these angles on the eye sockets, on the brow, and how they meet up with the bridge of the nose right there. That's where most of the likeness in a portrait lives, right in this zone right here. That's where a lot of our facial recognition is coming from, both for us and for our phones too. I've noticed with my phone, the rest of my face can be blocked, and if it sees this part of my face, it'll recognize me. But I have this one pair of sunglasses that kind of blocks that area a little bit. If I have those on my phone, the facial recognition of my phone does not recognize me. So I think it all comes back to this zone right there. That's where most of the likeness in your face is going to live. For us as painters, it's really useful because these bony landmarks, the skeleton landmarks, the landmarks of the skull, they don't they don't move around. The mouth is very expressive. It's kind of always moving, so it's a lot harder to target those relationships. But the eye sockets aren't really going anywhere. The way the eye sockets relate to the bridge of the nose is really important in the likeness. So if you're drawing a portrait, painting a portrait, if something feels off and it looks like a face and it's a face that makes sense, it's just not the one you're trying to draw or paint, check in with this area right here and make sure all of these proportions are lining up. Between the two eye sockets here, we have this shape. Call this like the keystone shape. You can see it right here. It's like upside down trapezoid shape. Uh, this shape too, super important. Connecting the two eye sockets. So if we look on the skull right here again, you can see where this is lining up just like that. You might remember this from when we painted a skull earlier in the semester. That area was really important. I'm going to erase some of these lines just so we can see a little bit better. So let's say the brow is about halfway. If we divide this in half again, so we're a quarter of the way up from the bottom or 3/4 of the way down from the top, that should give us roughly the base of the nose. So noses can vary quite a bit. There's a couple things that I look for right off the bat. I look for the base of the nose, where the nose is connecting to the rest of the face. We can then go from the inside corner of this eye socket right here, or like the inside tear duct of the eye, that inside corner right over here, this zone. If we go straight down from here, that should get us close. Again, it's not perfect. None of these rules are absolutely scientifically accurate, but pretty close to the outside edge of that nostril, kind of a straight line. So not the pupil of the eye. The pupil of the eye going straight down brings us towards the corner of the mouth, which we could see here. So going from here straight down should get us roughly to that outside edge of the nose there. So I look for that when I'm doing a portrait. It also helps bridge the gap from just kind of this distance here. Whenever I paint people, I tend to make their noses a little too long, and it's because I'm giving them there's too much space from the bottom of the eye socket to the top of the nostril here. So those landmarks help me line that up. Another thing I look for in the nose is the front and the side plane. So in here in the eye socket, just redraw this. So we have the eye socket here. Remember, think about the person's skull, and then think about how that bone comes out and wraps around where the bridge of the nose connects to the brow above, giving us this side plane shape here. And here's the eyeball fitting into the eye socket, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I look for all of these different planes. Again, that's where the likeness comes from, and that's also where we're going to see that's what's creating these shadows here. So this shadow right here, when we're mapping out our shadow shapes, we're going to start this painting the same way we've done with all the other ones. We're going to get our basic drawing down, and then we're going to look for the light and shadow shapes and how they interact. If we can overlay that with all of this information, it's going to be a lot easier to understand how these are lining up. So side plane of the nose right here, this brow is casting a shadow onto that side plane of the bridge of the nose right here. And then this is catching a lot of light right here. And then finally, last thing I'll consider in the nose, down here for the tip of the nose, sometimes I'll make some kind of a sphere just to show that volume. Sometimes I'll do more of like a longer oval here for that front plane of the nose. Noses vary quite a bit because they're cartilage. All of our noses grow just a little bit differently. They're all the same basic shapes. They're just kind of squashed and stretched around depending on who you are. Noses noses vary quite a bit because it's not that solid bone of the skull that we have up here. All this cartilage can be a little bit different. And then the nostrils. Don't overdo it with the nostrils. They're like a surface detail that, similar to like the eyelids or the facial hair, the lips. We'll get to that stuff later. But when you're starting out, if you're trying to get the likeness, which means that you're trying to make it look like the person that you're painting, think more about these really basic structures that we're drawing right now.
Yeah,
And
that's the hardest part, getting it to look like the person you're painting.
yeah, I agree.
Mine turn out to look like somebody else usually.
Yeah, because even we can get all this stuff really dialed in and still paint someone, and still it's like, I think that has to do with how we recognize faces and everything, what that means to us when we see a face that we know. I think it's so funny that when we draw a face, not only does it not quite look like the one we're trying to draw, we think it's someone else. We're like, this looks like someone who's not them, you know?
Right.
It's
Well,
funny.
I was going to say I've only done one or two, but I noticed that you could just make a tiny little change and it affects the whole look of the person. Like
Totally.
something like in the way you do the lips or the nose, just some little thing.
Yeah. I was watching this documentary about face blindness, like it's prosopagnosia, or I don't know if I'm saying that wrong, I think, but when you can't recognize faces and because people have that condition where like their vision is fine, it's just the way they put together the features of the face to recognize someone, that part of their brain is not working right, and they won't be able to recognize the face. They don't remember their own family members or what they look like, so they have to like leave little clues to know
Yeah,
who's
that
who.
happens not infrequently in strokes. Call it aphasia.
Yeah.
It could be visual, it could be speech.
Yeah. And so in this documentary, they referenced this paper where they did this experiment on a guy who had a head injury, and they that part of it, he didn't have that condition, but they were, I don't know how it all worked out. I'm not telling the story too well, but they were able to send, what is it called if you like send a I don't know, like electrical waves through a certain part of the brain to stimulate it, just to kind of excite that area of the brain, I guess. It doesn't like hurt the person or anything, but basically they were like, we think it's this part of the brain that recognizes faces, and we want to test that out and just tell us what you feel when we do that. So they like sent these electrical waves through that part of the brain, and he talked about what he experienced, and he said he had to like look at this person's face while they did it, and he said while they did it, that person's face changed. Like his features didn't move or anything, but his face became someone else. And then they turned it off and the face went back to who he
Oh,
had known the person to be, which I
interesting.
thought was really cool. And it just all of this I'm explaining it just because it reminds me of painting a portrait and exactly what Larry said about changing one little thing and it becomes someone else. Or you might fix something and it actually becomes the person you're trying to paint. And that could go either way over and over again throughout the whole process of painting a portrait. And it all
I
comes down
think,
to those structural things of the planes.
yeah, I think one other point you could make is that we're attuned to recognizing faces unlike anything else. We really we see very small changes and differences, and we're just really good at it.
Yeah.
And when you try to reproduce that face, boy, the
Yeah.
inner critic just won't let you get away with anything. So,
Yeah. And I think that like the way so like we're so attuned to body language and facial expressions and every all the micro expressions of a mouth and like the way people break down the Mona Lisa and trying to understand what she's trying to express with her face. Like that painting's so good because it's so subtle, but it's all of that is focused directly at our ability to understand someone else's face. And it's so cool, but that's what makes it so hard. And I think that's why when I teach portrait drawing or portrait painting, most of what I'm doing is trying to break bad habits of just like, okay, I'm going to start out with just the pupils of the eyes and focus in there, and then I'll do the lips, and then I'll figure everything else out around that. So I'm saying do the opposite because it's because we're drawn to those features is because we pay so much attention to them and we weigh them so heavily when we look at another person and talk to them. We look into their eyes. We might watch their mouth move or watch what facial expressions they make. So we want to focus on that in the drawing. And then especially we put it down on the paper and now there's a face on the page looking up at us that's also communicating stuff that we're trying to understand. Even if we drew it ourselves, we may not be in control of their expression. So that's part of what makes this all such a tricky thing. It's a lot easier. I always say it's easier to draw like a tree or a chair or a snowy mountain than a human face, just for that reason. We didn't evolve to understand the micro expressions of a chair. But the more we understand these basic construction concepts, the easier that's going to be. And again, if that's something you're interested in, the more you practice these in school, we had to draw these for like weeks from all different angles, turning them around. I'd be like drawing it next to my notes for other classes just because it was like practice over and over and over. You'll start to look at faces and see these things. You'll see, not just what their skull might look like, but you'll be thinking about all these different planes and these different rules. So keep it in mind, try and notice it out in the wild. One more thing while we're still on the brow and the nose here. So we can't see it in this image, but if we go straight across, I'm kind of going down to the side here because of the side plane of the face here, which I'll talk about in a second. But from the top of the brow to the base of the nose is going to give us the top and bottom of the ear. Placing the ear is one of the most important landmarks on the face for a couple of reasons. Mostly, the ear is on the side of the face. It's like the only real feature that's easy to pick out, like in an instant on the side of the face. And it being on either side, even though we can't see the other one over here, it gives us perspective. The face can have perspective, just like if we were to draw like a building or something, we'd be able to tell like how that shape is tilted based on those 2 points. So that's another thing to look out for on the head, is finding both of the ears and using them as a landmark, using them as a tool to place the other things. Because sometimes you don't have a great view of something here on the face and you have to figure out where it might be. You may not see this part of the brow. Maybe there's hair covering it. Maybe someone has a hat on. Maybe it's just the angle you're looking at. But if you can understand where the ears are, the top and bottom of the ears and how they're lining up, it's a shortcut to knowing where the base of the nose is and where the top of the brow is.
That's interesting. My wife, who's a dermatologist, but does a lot of plastic surgery, or does, the cancer surgery on the face. She says that one landmark is the tip of the nose going to the trachea of the ear. I don't know if you've heard that. If you could draw
Oh, no. What is
the trachea is that little bump.
this thing?
Right.
Huh.
But see if it works out. I don't know, but
Yeah, I'm looking right now. It might.
my
Maybe,
nose is not a good example.
maybe I'm a little off. Yeah, I don't know. So, well, that's cool.
I don't know if but that's what she says.
I'm gonna look out for that. Well, it's important too because I'm saying the base of the nose lines up with the bottom of the ear, but it's important to recognize the tip of the nose is not necessarily the base of the nose. That plane is not, it's rarely like horizontal. The tip of the nose is a little bit higher up than the base of the nose here. So that makes sense. If we go straight across from here, that bump should line up right around there. Noses are weird. They're hard to
We're not seeing what you're drawing.
cartilage, and they keep growing. That's what I've heard, is that they grow. Oh, sorry, I'm not sharing my screen. From here to here. I've heard that noses continue to grow and your ears continue to grow. Looks like those line up. But so, especially here, if you look at my sunburned head again, as I tip my head and kind of turn it around, you'll notice, like, let's say I'm like leaning my head back a little bit, the bottoms of my ears are kind of lining up with my mouth. Tops of my ears are kind of at the bottom of the eye socket. That's a really helpful measurement because that will tell you, like, oh, the head is tilted back without really having to look too hard at everything else. Just by looking at the ears, like, let's say if I tilt my head this way or that way, you can look in your own camera if you want. Think about how your ears are telling us about how your head is tilted, because the head can tilt left and right and forward and back, and all of these things we're talking about. Let me share my screen again. All of this stuff, it's not that it goes out the window and doesn't apply anymore. It's still really useful. The fact that if these aren't lining up, that just means the head is tilted, which it usually is. I mean, I rarely paint a portrait straight on like this. I kind of like these 3/4 views. Now that we know where the ear is, something else I'll look for is coming down. So this line I'm about to draw is another generalization. It's not an actual part of the anatomy of the skull or the head, really. It's a generalization, like an abstraction, but it's just a design thing to help you move along in your drawing and painting. Going from the ear, top of the ear down towards the chin will give you this like side angle of the cheekbone. We see it a little bit on this side, but barely. And the wetsuit is kind of messing around with that left side of the head right there. But going from here to here, it shows us where that arch, is it the zygomatic arch? Where's my skull? So this right here is kind of where that gets started. But I draw this line from the top of the ear, where the ear is connecting to the head here, down through the chin. That's going to help you find this transition from light to shadow or from dark to light going in the other direction, whichever way it's going in. It's important to recognize this is a plane change. So if you see like a triangle of light on the person's cheek, think about how that light falls off like it's a cliff, just like with our landscape painting from last week. That light falling off is describing form. That form is coming from this plane change right here. So that's a useful one for me, going from the top of that ear down to the chin right there. That then sets us up for the chin and the mouth. So this area is a little bit more complicated. And again, I can't stress enough that find these other landmarks first before you look at the mouth. All those reasons I mentioned earlier about the subtle expressiveness of the face making portraiture so tricky, I think it's strongest in the mouth. The mouth is really soft. It's a lot of soft forms. It's moving around a lot, and it's very, very expressive. So we want to take it slow. We want to be methodical about it. So I draw a little sphere here for the chin. Let me draw a better one. That sphere was not very good. Let me just go over it here first. There's a little sphere right here, tilted on its side, and then there's more of a, this is more of an ellipse. Sorry, this is more of a sphere for the mouth. And they overlap here. That's what the dotted lines are representing. They're overlapping here. And this also overlaps with the base of the nose. So this ellipse shape for the chin, again, it's more of an ellipse. It's a little bit smaller. It's kind of sitting on its side like that. And then for the mouth, it's more of a sphere. Not a full sphere. I always think of it as a shaped sort of like a contact lens on the surface of the face. Let me show you on the skull real quick. So I talked about this when we painted our skull a few weeks back. The whole mouth is curved. So you can see from the top through the bottom here, the teeth are sort of spherical, and that's how the light is affecting it. So ignore the teeth themselves for a minute and think of this as a sphere. If I tilt this back, you can also see how round this is. So going left to right, very round, going from top to bottom, it's super round. The mouth itself, like the lips, are kind of wrapping around that too. So again, it goes for all the features of the face, but the mouth especially. It's not just like a sticker on a flat surface that you just kind of draw lips across. It's a three-dimensional form. Think about what the teeth are doing and then how the lips are kind of wrapping around that. It's going to show up as acting like a sphere. It's like just like kind of a slice of the edge of a sphere kind of sitting on top of all of that. So this cast shadow from the nose, especially, and I'll go over the shadow shapes in a minute too. Part of this is from the facial hair right there, but if we think of this like a sphere overlapping with the nose right there, getting hit by light from this direction, this is our highlight, and then this is our form shadow over here. So whenever I talk about light logic, I always bring it back to the spherical shape like this, and we can understand this as like a form shadow going from light side into the dark side over here. If we can understand the mouth as that as just like a general shape beneath all those forms, that too is going to help you get all this other more complicated stuff on top of it. Another thing, so for the mouth, I'll draw another mouth over here. Oops. So we don't see it too much in this photo, but I still think it's important to go over. And there's a couple of things that I'm going over in this lecture that are not totally present in this photo. I just thought it was such a great image. I was excited to paint it with the wetsuit. So if there's anything we're not talking about here that you want me to go over in greater detail, please let me know. Let's go back to my handout real quick. So I didn't include the mouth in great detail in this because, again, I want you to focus on those stronger structures underneath. Here's that sphere for the mouth, an ellipse for the chin. That's what I'm drawing right here. I mentioned earlier, if you go straight down from the pupils of the eyes, that gives you, it gets you kind of close to where the corners of the mouth might be. And it's not perfect, and both your pupils and the mouth move around a lot. So it's not the best rule ever, but it can be helpful. So that's our like underlying structure. I'm gonna lighten this and draw on top of it. This line just represents roughly where the mouth might land. Let's go get a much darker color here. Okay. So if these are two corners of the mouth here, I'll start out looking for an ellipse on its side for the top lip here. Kind of similar to the chin. These planes coming down from the nostrils is called the philtrum. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. I always struggle with that word. But if you go down from your nose, down the top lip, you're going to have these different plane changes. So that sort of interrupts that ellipse right here. But that ellipse is important in the middle of the top lip. That gets nested into these two ellipses just beneath that. And you get this little triangle of these three ellipses right here. So I'm going to lighten this again, draw on top of it. That gives us a path for the like lip line through here to build the rest of the lips out of. So it might seem familiar from that still life we did. There was that cast, that plaster cast of a mouth. But just like with looking at the larger sphere for the mouth, think about how the light is hitting this, hitting the whole mouth in general, but also hitting these smaller little ellipses here. Typically, if the light is coming from above, the top lip will be more in shadow. And the bottom lip will be catching more light. Then we have another downward facing plane beneath the bottom lip here. And then we have two more spheres. I know this is a lot of spheres for the mouth, but again, it's the best way to understand the light. This kind of makes like a Mickey Mouse shape with the chin here. These two forms are kind of at the bottom corners of this whole mouth sphere. And this shape will show up. Again, depending on the light, depending on the person, these forms around the mouth are just as important as the mouth itself. So think again, I know I'm a broken record with all this and being repetitive, but think about the larger shapes first. Don't be confused by like the icon of a mouth or the shape of lips according to how lipstick is used. Think about all these basic underlying shapes and then finding those are more emergent features on the surface.
Do the circles that you have underneath the lower lip, that represents like a little bit of a highlight next to the shadow?
Down here,
Yeah.
yes. So I just think of these just like similar to the other forms. Like if the light's coming from above and to the right, it might cast a little bit of a shadow like that. So let's look at the photo. Can't quite see it on this one. It's a little bit foreshortened here. And the wetsuit is kind of messing. The wetsuit's kind of pushing this little form out right here. Now we can see this one here is catching light. So a little bit brighter right here, a little bit of a shadow right there. It's very, very subtle, but recognizing that little sphere will help just so it's not too much of a void of just like, okay, here's the mouth. And then somewhere down here is the jawline. I want you to understand like how one form leads into the next. So there's that form here. This is that downward facing plane beneath the lip, and then that meeting up with that ellipse of the chin right there. Did that answer your question, or did I not hear it right?
No, that's good. It's
Okay. One more thing, and I know, thanks for sticking with me on this. I know it's a lot all at once. I wanted to talk about how the eyes fit into the eye sockets, and this is an important one. I'm going to lighten all of this. So going back to the shape of the eye socket, picturing what that skull looks like under the skin, under the wetsuit. So there's our eye socket. Let me fill this in a little bit darker now. Or actually, no. First, I'm going to draw the eyeball. Okay. So the eyeball is literally just a sphere sitting in the eye socket. So a little bit of negative space in two of the corners here. But the eye has dimension. Just like the other features, it's not, don't think of it as like the flat icon of an eye that's symmetrical like this. And then we draw the eyelashes. Don't do that. We want the eye to have form and dimension. So these pink areas right here represents like, it's not really negative space, but if you feel around in your own eye, you can kind of feel like those areas where there's just a little bit more space, kind of near the tear duct on either side. I think it's important because we tend to see light or shadows in there. So the eyeball is sitting like it's fit inside of the eye socket. It's not like popping out. It's not, it can vary how deep set someone's eyes might be. Like I feel like mine are really far back. It's like a cave or something. Maybe the eye sockets themselves are not as shallow. That's something that can vary from person to person. But what I want you to recognize is just how the eyelid wraps around that sphere of the eye. Like it has dimension on its own, especially on this one over here. You can really see like, and it's kind of hard to see from the photo now. There's so much drawing going on here, but wrapping around that form of the eye. I'll draw it up over here. So let's say that is our, I'm going to draw this left eye socket right here. So here would be that bridge of the nose area, that side plane and front plane of the nose. Here's that cast shadow we can see in the photo. This right here. And then the way the eyelids wrap around. I'm exaggerating it a little bit just so it's extra clear. Think about how it's really wrapping around that form there, and not quite symmetrical. At least on him, the bottom eyelid is a little bit more horizontal, but it's not like a football shaped. So pay close attention to those forms and don't overestimate the space between the eyelids. That's something I see all the time, um, especially on this photo. But like a lot of the portraits I do, there's not a lot happening within the eyes. We project a lot of stuff that we think is happening there. We make the whites of the eyes actually white. They're rarely ever white unless you're like staring into the sun, which we know we're not supposed to do. It's usually like a darker gray. We think we call it the white of our eyes just as like white as like a color, but not as a value, if that makes sense. So don't underestimate, sorry, don't overestimate the amount of space in there. The eyelids themselves have dimension. There's a little bit of it's like a plane change right in here. It has like an edge to them. And also up here, think about where the eye sort of fits into there's muscles around the eye, into the eye socket there. That is a line that we tend to see as well. So think about the form of the eyeball itself as a sphere, the eyelids wrapping around that, and then how that's fitting into the harder edge of the eye socket surrounding all of it. All of those things together will show up in the light and shadow. Again, that's really where this is all going. I know this is a ton of information, probably overdoing it. That's okay. I just want it to be there for you. If you want to, we're just scratching the surface. If you want to dig into this more, I encourage it. But what this all adds up to is how the light and shadows are interacting with each other across the forms of the head. And then there's like, the surface details, like the wrinkles in the skin, the eyebrow, the facial hair, any of that stuff it's literally just happening on the surface. Think mostly about form and edges and light and shadow. And we'll talk about color too, but that's where it all starts. Looks like he has goggles on. Are there any questions about all this stuff? I know it's kind of overcomplicating something, and I know it's a watercolor painting class, but for doing portraits, I like starting there and kind of slowly, methodically tackling.
Shane, you said that, when you measure from the tip of the ear to the chin, that's often where shadow is. When you said that,
Yeah, just like a simple plane change. So if you look at my face on here right now, this light's coming from up here, casting down in this direction. You can kind of see from here across here, this line of my cheek.
yeah, yeah,
That's the plane change I'm talking about. On the skull, it's just way more complicated because there's all these forms right here. But it's coming from is that the zygomatic arch? I
yeah,
never
that's
remember
it.
if I'm
That's
saying
what it
that right.
is. And then the orbits have a lot of shadow in the inferior part, I think.
Yeah, it's coming. I think of it as coming from the ear down to the chin there. And that's like a simplified design thing, but it's just to kind of help me build the face. It's all kind of a placeholder to kind of get me to the point where I start looking at really specific details, but it's important, like getting good at this stuff comes from not drawing one or two really drawn out detailed portraits, but doing lots of them in like 5 minutes or less is how I recommend practicing this stuff. But that being said, we are going to do a long portrait. We're going to do a long painting.
Shane, this is the second time I've been through this. Your construction of the mouth is always I really appreciate that, because the three circles and sort of lining the lips through that, it had always been just kind of um, sort of I draw the line, but never know exactly what I want, how I should do it, and that subtle just uh, up, down, and up motion of that, and just getting that through and feeding it through three circles really made it more intuitive. I like
Cool.
I like the way that it expresses what's going on.
Oh, I'm glad. Yeah, because it's hard. Drawing mouths, painting mouths is really hard, I think, and for those reasons we talked about, it's once you get something a little bit off, it's just like, oh, now this person on the canvas or on the paper is looking back at me with this weird expression because it's so tricky to get that line right. So if you start from like the ground up, starting off with bigger shapes and then kind of stacking more and more complex forms, but still be trying to be subtle about it, it's a little bit easier. And those three spheres, how they all line up, that can change from person to person, but they're always there. Like the relationships are there, but the pieces themselves can be scaled up or down or thicker or thinner depending on the person. We can take a quick break just before we start painting. I'd like to do a little color study here, and then for homework, I'd like you to make the drawing to like prepare for the painting. Maybe we'll start working on just laying in the painting. But I do want to do a quick smaller color study to start. But let's do a we'll do a 10-minute break. I can feel myself losing my voice. I'm gonna drink some more water. It's 10:24. We come back at 10:34 and we could start painting. If you want to grab a smaller piece of paper, or you could use a sketchbook, anything you want to experiment with. I just want to do a smaller color study. Are there any other questions? All right, I'll see you in 10 minutes. All right, so I'm just using this small sketchbook here to get started on this color study. I might even use some pencil to sharpen up some of the details. It's to just to the get to know the picture in preparation for the larger piece. I don't have to use tape for this, but I like having it just nice and neat in the sketchbook. And what I like to do here is just work out composition, what I might want to focus on in the painting, what's important to me. One thing I've been thinking about lately is painting like in and out of focus. If we watch a movie or look at photography, the focus of the camera can really tell us where to look, even though, like, for our own vision, focus is pretty intuitive and not something we think about. When we're drawing and painting, with the amount of detail and with how specific we want to be about certain things, we too can direct the viewer's eye around with what we could think of as focus. So in the reference image, again, I'm painting. Let me just make sure we're all on the same page here. Painting this guy in the wetsuit here. This white space around the edge I left just to kind of show like what the page would look like with the tape on it. I don't always do that, but I just wanted to, I don't know, giving that a try this time. But right now, the way I'm drawing is right up to the edge with thinking about how the figure comes up against the edge of the frame of the picture and, the relationships of positive and negative space. That's something we spoke about last week a little bit too with composition in general, is painting a portrait and the amount of space, the amount painting the air around someone's head can be an important element in the painting. So that's something I'm thinking about here. And even though I've worked it out in the photo, like I've already placed the head where I think it should go. So that getting that photo together and cropping it, editing it the way that I did, that too is a form of a compositional study, but still I want to show you here what that feels like on the page. And we don't really know until we try. Once we start making marks on the page is really where we figure all this stuff out. So I'm just thinking about like the amount of positive and negative space here, the amount of figure versus everything else, empty space, and the distance from the top of the head to the top of the frame there, from the side of the head to the side of the picture over here. All these little decisions being made are all here to serve whatever it is we want to focus on. Which for a portrait, it's the person's face, the expression they might make, and what that might mean. But even these different like pieces of the wetsuit, they're all components of the larger whole here. And whatever is useful about them, I want to make sure I include. And whatever is not that useful, I'm just going to choose to ignore. But I like this zipper across the collarbones, this piece of the neoprene from the wetsuit coming down in that direction, and these subtle lines that are being created across the shoulder. So just like we did with the landscape, we want to use what helps our picture in whatever way that we can. And sometimes it's not necessarily, do I leave this in or do I take it out? Sometimes you take something and change it depending on what the composition calls for. So going back to what we worked on earlier, if I know where the bottom of the chin is, the top of the skull, the back of the skull from how we see it here, I can figure out roughly where that line for the brow might be for the eyes. At a little bit of an angle, left and right. I want to say the right eye might be a little bit higher than the left. Let me share my screen real quick to show you what I mean. Not actually higher on his face, but just from the angle that we're looking. If this line goes right through the pupil there, yeah, it's lining up with like the top of the eye over here. So that tells me that the head is tilted a little bit. So we're at a 3/4 angle, meaning like we're seeing both sides of the face, but one side more than the other. His eyes or his ears covered by the wetsuit, but we know that this is the ear right here, but we can't quite use it as a landmark. So just looking at one eye and how it relates to the other, this one's a little bit higher, so that tells me that the head is tilted just the tiniest bit. So all those like so-called rules we went over with regarding head construction, they're just to help us get started, but they're not something we rely on 100%. We also want to look at what's in front of us. And just use like that regular comparative measuring. So going from the eye to the chin here, if I divide that in half again, that should get us somewhere near where the base of the nose might be. And I don't want to go too crazy on this drawing, but I think that's a pretty good starting point. Maybe I'll outline this shadow shape here inside the eye socket coming up against that side plane of the nose. But I think that's more than enough to get started with. So I'll hold this up a little bit closer. And again, this is just the color study for a larger piece. So I'm really taking my time here. Last week and I'm erasing some of my lines just so they don't show up too dark. But last week we kind of used that sense of urgency in a painting as a tool to be more expressive. This week we're kind of going in the opposite direction. We're being very methodical and thoughtful about each move that we're making. And not to say one is better than the other. I think they're both useful in different ways, and I want you to feel what both of them have to offer. What would you say is like the general consensus for each of you? It's a small group, so I feel like it's easy to discuss that stuff. But do you like being slow and methodical with watercolor, or would you prefer to be looser and more expressive? No wrong answers.
Well, because I don't know. I think it depends how I feel that day.
Yeah,
And I'm not experienced enough to really know. I think I'd rather learn how to do it correctly first and then be more expressive.
that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. I always think it's easier to like once we learn the rules, we can break them in more interesting ways.
I always wonder on some of these painters that are sell their paintings for a lot of money, but it looks like a 10-year-old could do it. Are they
Yeah.
really good painters? I mean, did they start off painting realistically and then they just got, I'm talking about real kind of ultra modern type art that you see.
Right. Right. Yeah, it depends. I mean,
I had the Shane, I had the chance to go to Barcelona, and they have a museum there of Picasso. And it turns out that he was there as a student, so it's mostly just his very early work. And he looks like a classical 18th century painter when he's painting these beautiful things. Of course, he's a young kid, and they're beautiful paintings, and you'd never suspect that he'd go off and create 5 different styles of his own in very
yeah,
abstract ways.
Yeah, I
So
would,
he had the skills, boy, there's no doubt about it. But I'm not sure all of the um,
I th
painters can do that with portraits. But yeah.
yeah, I th I think some painters like him maybe they move so far so fast. I think what would take most of us a lifetime, they can get in like a year or two of practice, or maybe 10 years even. And I think they get like, I don't know if bored is the right word, but they start to just, it's like a way of deconstructing the whole system, the whole way of working is taking it apart and putting it back together again in a new way. And I think you could find that in different art forms across the board. My go-to example always is Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin. He is like a classically trained guitarist, but he applied it to looser, more expressive kinds of music. And
Frank Zappa too.
yeah, okay, yeah, that's another good one. There was a, and I mentioned this in a different class the other day, but we were talking about, maybe it was this class, so sorry if I'm being repetitive, but someone described playing music with Miles Davis, and they accidentally hit the wrong note. So the next note that he played made their wrong note right. And like that to me is like all those different kinds of discipline and being really skilled, but also being open to like new things happening. I don't know. I can't, it's hard to even express all that, but I think that is like the best place to be, is a good balance of a really developed skill set and being open-minded, because they can step on each other too. The more hardcore you go learning the skills, the more you close yourself off to being open and expressive and trying to evolve things. So it's kind of always an ongoing thing in my head, but I think it's important to talk about. Just in the meantime, I'm mixing a shadow shape color for here. Actually, before I do that, sorry, I'm being, speaking of being impulsive, yeah, before I do that, I want to get a general color for the face. Because remember, this is a color study. I mean, it's a color study, it's a compositional study, it's just a study in general, but for the general skin tone, going light to dark, I'm going to mix some cadmium yellow and some cadmium red together to get a really bright orange. And I'm adding lots of water. And I'm anticipating going over this with my shadows. But there are areas like the tip of the nose, this side plane of the nose next to the eye socket, that are a little bit lighter. So I'll use lots of water. And I want to think about the local color of the face too. So local color refers to the actual color of whatever it is that you're painting. So if you're painting a fire truck, regardless of what the light and shadow might be doing, a fire truck is red. So The tip of the nose is a little bit more red here. Areas of the cheeks are a little bit more red. I'm going to add a little bit of quinacridone magenta, or we could add a little bit of cad red, or maybe both. We're just pushing it a little bit more towards red. Gives us more of like a reddish tint there. Maybe that's a little too dark. Like the facial hair is definitely more yellow, almost more towards brown and kind of greenish, maybe. And I'm gonna let that dry. In the meantime, as that dries, I can work on the background and block that in. There's a little bit of a gap between the sky in the background and the face with that wetsuit, so we can do the wetsuit after that, or maybe after we go back into the face. For the background, I'm going to use, let's try out just cerulean blue, but I'm going to push it a little bit thicker. It's a pretty saturated blue. I'll add a little bit of ultramarine. I'm using like a moderate amount of pigment. It's not too heavy and dark. We don't want to overpower the figure, but
The ultramarine is for the shadows there, or?
no, the ultramarine, I mixed the ultramarine with some cerulean blue for the background color.
Oh, okay.
It's pretty solid. I think this, so the sky tends to get more blue towards the top and lighter towards the horizon. So I'm going to go for it all at once here.
You often do the background first, Shane, and paintings, just out of curiosity.
It depends. Like if it's a light sky with a darker foreground, I definitely recommend doing the background first, even if not first, like doing it a little earlier in the painting. You don't want to save it for later. Like I think we mentioned that with the mountain paintings last week.
Oh, right, right.
Everything was so light and subtle that like saving it for the end, we kind of like had to be really careful along that like ridge line across the top because the way those edges like talk to each other is really, really subtle and light. So that one would be good to start off with the sky, which I think I didn't do. So that was, I should have. Here I'm using the sky to like really cut out the figure. Sometimes like it depends on the painting. If we have like a really solid plan, which it's good to have a plan, um, then starting with the sky is good. But sometimes like some of those landscape studies we were doing, I kind of liked just approaching the blank paper and just kind of using the shadow shapes to compose the picture. So that it could go either way. Definitely early on in the painting, though, I would be looking at what the sky is doing. It's coming out kind of streaky. It might be this paper. I don't use this sketchbook too often. And now I'm going to block in, again, just another big, larger shape. Just a general shape for the wetsuit. So I'm mixing burnt sienna with ultramarine blue. I'm using some of the blue that's left over from the sky to get a nice dark, dark gray. It's not necessarily black, but it's like a dark, cool gray. There is some variation in there with warm and cool. Looking at where the light is hitting the wetsuit, I would say is a little bit warmer, and maybe the really dark shadows are a little bit cooler. So maybe I'll add in a tiny bit of yellow ochre to get this muddy, still pretty cool, darker gray. And I also want to think there's a softer edged form shadow under the chin. There's like a mix of softer and sharper shadows. So if there might be some room for some more wet into wet painting here on the wetsuit. Just like we talked about with head construction, we want to find the larger underlying transitions first. Yeah, it's so hard to talk and paint sometimes. I got to this part right here and just
Yeah, I don't know how you do it.
totally lost my train of thought.
Yeah. And then take questions at the same time.
Yeah, it's good practice.
Yeah,
Good
did you do
practice
the
for
yellow ochre with ultramarine rather than with burnt sienna? Because I love that gray, but you wanted something a little cooler.
well, it's a little this is I'm trying to keep it pretty light and it's ultramarine, burnt sienna, and yellow ochre. All three of those. And I'm anticipating pushing these shadows darker later on. But where I find any like larger transitions, I'm gonna try to call that out now. So what I mean by that is like, let's see, like the chin looks more yellow. This seems more blue over here. Maybe where I feel like where the light hits it and where the wetsuit is kind of more worn out, which with these wetsuits, it tends to be in the shoulders, around the face. It's just getting more stretched out. So that part of the wetsuit is aging a little bit faster. And I think those parts might be a little bit more yellow. And then where the wetsuit still feels a little bit more new, I feel like it's more blue purple. And I might be like projecting that. I might be kind of making that up even. Maybe just there's just a littlest bit of yellow, but it doesn't even really matter. That's whether it's there or not, I want to push it. So I'm going to do that here if I can. And then definitely when I go in and like carve out those darker shadow shapes, I'm going to be more heavy-handed with those. Definitely underneath the chin where the chin kind of turns down towards the neck right there is a softer, smoother transition. So let me just, I'm going to fill all this in and then I'm going to try to address that wet into wet. So I'm just going to grab a little bit more pigment. That's probably too big though, because I don't want to, there's light hitting the jawline that I'm kind of getting rid of. So I may have messed that up after all that. Just going to try and unify all of this. I think some of the negative space under the chin got a little bit lost here. So I can rebuild that later with a darker and sharper shadow. Hopefully by now the face is kind of a little more dried out. I'm gonna clean off my palette. I finally found out what I'm teaching in the fall. So I've gotten a few messages from students about this summer. I'm not teaching this summer. Because it conflicts with my other job, but I will be back in the fall. I'm only teaching one section of watercolor. So if you'd like to take this class again, as soon as it's available for you to sign up, I recommend doing it because it does fill up pretty quick. Although I do let everyone into the class. I guess what I meant to say is there's only going to be the one section. I know this semester there were two. I'm glad for everyone who ended up in this class on Friday. We have a nice small group, so we get more painting time, we get more critique time. My Monday class has over 45 people in it, I think, and it's hard to give time to everybody. It's really hard.
I missed some of that. Hey, Shane, are you doing an oil class again?
I'm not in the fall. I'm sad. I wish I was. I wanted to be, but I'm doing two drawing classes, one beginner drawing class, an intermediate drawing class, and then a the same watercolor class that we're in now.
Do you know when they start signing up for that?
I'm not sure. I don't know if it's happened. It's probably going to be a couple of weeks because I just got that paperwork, but
Let's see. It's too.
I believe the first day is going to be April 23rd.
oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
if you can get in as soon as possible, whenever your time is. Of course, you're on a, I'm not a wait list, but you're on a schedule of time period. You get an assigned date and time.
Yeah. Once it's open, I'll definitely let everyone know. I'll post the links
Good.
and all that.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I usually sign
Okay.
up for everything very late. I never know what I'm going to do the week.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Oh, by the way, I'm doing short Tai Chi form this summer. It's only 8 weeks for the semester or the summer session. So if you want to get your feet wet, take a little Tai Chi class. There's going to be 2 and 3 day sessions, and they're all in person. You can look up on the website to see what the days and times are.
Awesome.
I'd like to talk to you sometime about that. I sent in a letter to Saddleback about teaching a basic course in medicine, and I never heard back. And it's kind of interesting that they're not all that responsive.
That's
Oh,
weird.
that's too bad. I would do a follow up because they're always looking for new classes. They've encouraged me to do something new, and I've wanted to teach a music class over there, but
Yeah.
the preparation, to pitch it is kind of involved. It's not just something like you say, well, here's my syllabus, and then they go
Right,
for it. You
right.
have to go through all these stages.
It is a long process. I have
But I
heard.
would follow up if you are serious. Then follow up and
I
see if
think
you
it'd
can
be
get.
fun. I teach the medical students right now on Zoom, but actually like to do a class with with just lay people, but
Yeah.
in person. I don't know how it's like Shane, you do it on Zoom because I don't know half the time who's listening and who isn't. You just see these little black boxes.
Yeah. I try to engage everyone as much as I can. Again, I like this group. You all are like to participate, which is great. I've had classes where it's just total silence for 3 hours, and like I don't totally mind that because I'm just kind of talking to myself while I paint, which is its own.
Yeah, but you don't know if people are listening or not,
Yeah,
or
it's like therapy for me, but
yeah.
I mean, I love being in the classroom, to be honest. I think
Exactly.
really
That's
makes
why
sense.
finally this semester I said, okay, no more online Tai Chi classes. It's hard to teach online, but
Yeah.
then you miss the whole social aspects of being with, I don't know, 20, 30 people and getting that, immediate feedback. And of course, you can provide feedback when you see
Right,
people that are not doing it quite right. And,
right.
you stuff.
That
It's
makes
entirely different.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's similar to even real quick, this is a little bit of burnt sienna with a little bit of alizarin crimson. And I think that's it. Just for this, I'm going for this shadow shape right in this corner, just because it's going to be a good landmark. I think it's an important one in the painting. I'm going to go over to the cast shadow on the other side of the nose with more quinacridone magenta, since it's cooler and darker. This shadow's lighter than the one I'm about to paint. But back to what you said, for the same reasons we're talking about with portrait painting, it's like teaching in person, you get a read on how everyone's doing by what their face does when you talk to them. You know if someone's confused, you know if someone is getting what you're saying, all based on very immediate feedback. And when that's not there, it can be confusing as a teacher too. Just like can't read the room if no one's there. So I'm keeping these shadows pretty light, but I'm just mapping them out. We've done this for a few different paintings now, making a map of our shadow shapes. This one under the brim of the wetsuit up here, again, is much darker than the last two, but I just want to get them in the right place, figure out the kinds of edges there might be. These are all pretty sharp, maybe on this bottom eyelid of his right eye, the eye on our left. Sorry, I'm a little dyslexic. That form might be a little bit softer, although, I mean, with this tiny painting, I'm not too worried about it. Down here beneath the nose, that shadow too, we could push later, but I'm going to keep on with this same mixture of it's burnt sienna, quinacridone magenta, little bit of yellow ochre, and I'm just making a map of the shadow shapes. So just like we did with our landscape last week, the shadow shapes define the light shapes define the shadow shapes, and they all link up and participate with each other and define each other.
Excuse me for introducing another subject here, but this is for Larry mainly. There is a doctor, Kathy Schmeidler, and she does a brain and wellness for older adults,
Oh,
and that's going on this semester as well.
oh,
She's very good. I took her class one time, and it's quite interesting. She's very thorough and very knowledgeable. So, brain function, choices in memory loss prevention,
uh,
etc.
yeah, that's fairly, so appropriate for that group. Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. She's good. She's funny too. She's from New York and quite a character. So I think we need you, Larry. We need more faculty.
I would
Mine
love to.
mine would be more talking about, um, how you find a doctor and navigate the medical system these days, and how to recognize common illnesses versus the illnesses that are more severe that really require immediate attention, that sort of thing.
I think that'd
I
be
think that
great.
sounds very
That's
good.
great
Yeah, that'd be
information.
very useful, for most people.
My wife's maternity leave right now is basically a part-time job between the state of California, the insurance, and her employer. No, I feel like no one entity knows exactly what's going on.
No, the system is very fragmented, Shane.
Yeah,
Uh, and just navigating through it is a challenge. You almost have to be a doctor. And even then, it's hard to find good doctors.
yeah. That sounds like really great information. I mean, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah,
Just
well, that's what I'm doing. I'm writing a book and I've got about 4 chapters
cool.
on just navigating the medical system these days. It's really a challenge.
Yeah,
So we'll see what happens with that.
yeah. Keep me posted. I'd love to read it.
Okay, I will.
As this dry, so I'll hold this up a little closer. You can see I'm like mapping out the shadow shapes really light. As that dries, again, I'm going to jump back to the wetsuit part of it here. I'm using ultramarine blue, some cadmium red to get more of a violet to counteract that warmer gray I put in earlier for the light part of it. I want to see how this goes. A little bit more pigment, pushing it a little bit darker. Now down here, so I'm taking a little bit more pigment, it's darker. Let me share my screen real quick so you can see exactly what I'm seeing. I'm going to use this chunk of this wetsuit right here to define the edge of the face here. So I'm doing two things at once. It's painting the wetsuit, but I'm also using this dark shape next to this lighter shape here, this brush stroke, and I'm trying to see this as a brush stroke. That will define that brow ridge here, the shape of the eye socket meeting that arch of the cheekbone right here. Again, a lot of the likeness is in those angles, those relationships, and this piece of the wetsuit is going to help to define that. That's that's my thinking going into it. Seeing that dark shape is like, it's like a little alarm goes off, like, okay, that's really useful right there. Let's pay attention to it. Let's turn up the volume on it a little bit. It's helping define the face and separating it from the background in an interesting way. See here, it's bleeding into that area, which I don't love. I should have waited a little longer, maybe. And again, this little sketch will live in the sketchbook forever, probably, but this is all going to hopefully serve the larger painting, and I'll really be ready for this and kind of warmed up for it.
So Shane, this is kind of off topic and I apologize.
Okay.
But I'm curious what I'm sketching still, but I'm curious and I'm a little frustrated with my pencil. So I'm curious what pencil you use to do your preparatory drawings.
Sure. I use this very fancy pencil from Home Depot at the
Yeah.
cash register.
No,
I love these. I
so you just
sharpen like
you
really crazy like this, but yeah.
say again, sharpen it.
I sharpen it like really kind of drawn out like this. Let me, whoops.
Using a knife or something?
Yeah, I'll show you right
Right.
now. Let's let this painting dry and I'll
Okay.
show you how I sharpen.
Question.
Is there another question?
No, I said that's a good question. How
Oh,
did
yeah.
you get it that sharp?
Yeah, let me, I don't know, oh, here it is. I usually demo this for my life drawing class, but I should do it for more of them. I use these flat razors like this, and so for my life drawing class, I'll use charcoal pencils and black Conte pencils. So pencils come in the box like this. And this isn't for watercolor, this is for life drawing, but it's a similar way of working. This is how they come in the pencil. This tip is not that useful for the way I like to draw. I like using the side of the pencil as much as the tip of it. when I sharpen it like this, I can use that whole side edge of the pencil and I can draw. It feels more like a paintbrush. And then
Mm.
if I need a really super sharp edge, I can sharpen it like that. And the act of drawing itself keeps this pretty sharp because I'm mostly using the side. So I don't really have to sharpen it all too often. Here are the ones I use for life drawing. These are like little spears, basically. But what I do is I use this flat razor and I just slowly carve away at the edges until that tip is like super long. And then I take this, you could use sandpaper. Sandpaper gets used up pretty quickly. This is a drywall sanding screen. These last like this one is a couple years old and I sharpen my pencils like a few times a week. I put it down here on the surface. I'll kind of flush to one edge at a time. So I'm not just sharpening the tip of the pencil, I'm trying to sharpen this whole side edge of the pencil here. And
Wow.
more about like removing, like grinding away this wooden part as it is about sharpening this. Because if you look at this, I'll show you real quick. Let's just do this. So I'm like clamped down with one hand, pushing and guiding with the other thumb, and rotating the pencil. So this is charcoal. The pencil I showed you is graphite. But this applies to both really. There's a little bit of glue between the charcoal and the wood of the pencil. So sometimes you can get a little caught up on that. I'm making really shallow cuts and I'm rotating the pencil throughout that whole process. And basically we want it to be consistent. We want it to be like, we want it to be predictable. That's the whole thing. Then I take this, hold on, let me grab a different one. So graphite, I use graphite and charcoal. You don't want them to mix on the page. They don't really like each other. So these look the same, I know, but this one I use for graphite. This is my charcoal one. So since this is a charcoal pencil, I'll use this one. But I cut out this drywall sanding screen. Let me pull up what that looks like at the hardware store. These. This will last a lot longer than sandpaper. I don't know why it's not loading. But I cut them up to fit onto this like wooden block right here. I've had this same one I've been using this for my life drawing class for like 5 or 6 years, I guess. And I'm making tiny little circles like this, grinding away at the wooden part just as much as the tip of the pencil.
Wow.
But I mean, this has a long way to go, but
Well, thank you. I noticed that tip when you were sketching. I was like, I've never seen a pencil like that
oh
before.
yeah,
Awesome.
these are just in like buckets at Home Depot at the cash
Like,
register. But you
oh,
can get a pretty good, like the lead's kind of like thicker, so like you can get a pretty crazy point out of it.
And that's called a pro sanding band.
Um, I if you just find a drywall sanding screen, I don't know why it won't let me open this up. Oh, here we go. They look like this when they come out of the packet, and I just cut it up to fit. It's good to have like some kind of support, just so you're not holding the screen. Your hand will get really dirty. And yeah, I just sand away. So this one, it's not quite as flush as I'd like it to be. Like these are the ones I use in class. These are really from the tip of the pencil to here is one flat flush surface. So I can draw with the whole side of it like that.
Wow.
I can draw with just like kind of pulling along the edge like that, or I can just get a really fine point. But what's fun is, if you get more used to it, is like linking all of those together for like all different kinds of
That's
marks.
great.
So for life drawing, it can be really useful. But I also use this, even like if I'm building something and I have to make really precise measurements, like this tip is really super sharp. But so as I sand this, I'm not just sanding the tip of it, I'm sanding the whole side of like most of what's getting ground away here is the wood.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's my pencil story.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. When I teach life drawing, we do that for a whole day. And it kind of gets me in the zone. Like it's a Karate Kid type stuff. Sanding your pencil. So if you take the drawing class, we'll do plenty of that. I'm excited this is all dried out now too. Let's see where we can go from here. So I had ultramarine blue and some cad red. We could throw in a little alizarin crimson or quinacridone magenta to push that violet, even though it's sort of laid back and under the radar. This violet, we could desaturate it with a little bit of yellow ochre, but this violet is going to talk to the more yellows and the lighter gray. So it can be helpful sometimes if you have cooler shadows having warmer light shapes, or if you have cooler light shapes having warmer shadows, even if it's really more of like a implicit thing, it can really turn the painting on temperature wise. So now that this is dry, I'm going to go in with more pigment again and try and rebuild what I kind of botched before with that bleeding edge here. Because that side plane of the head is important for getting the likeness of the person. I see this guy all the time, so it'll bother me if I don't get this right. Which is a good shortcut to making you really care about the painting. I mean, I don't know. Both are good. It's good practice to draw people that you don't know if they're strangers, because then you're not tied to getting their face accurate for like emotional reasons. But at the same time, painting a loved one or painting a self-portrait, especially, that drive to get it right might propel you forward. Or it could paralyze you with fear. One or the other. Hopefully not the second one. Adding a little bit more cad red for that cast shadow under the brim. So the cast shadow under the brim is definitely warmer because it's on his face rather than on the wetsuit. So I'm using that darker violet color for these shadows here on the wetsuit. But going down into here, now we're not on the wetsuit anymore. This is his skin where that cast shadow is kind of bending across. So just be aware of that. I added more cad red for that to just warm it up a little. And then I can go back to the more blue shadow for the rest of the wetsuit shadows here.
What colors are those, Shane? Is that ultramarine?
Yeah, this is that ultramarine, alizarin crimson, cad red. I kind of just made a supercharged dark purple with all of my reds and ultramarine. So here it's a little bit more subtle. I'm going to use more water. Just cleaned off my brush. Now I'm just pulling it around for a more softer transition. Maybe it'll counterbalance these sharper shapes.
Would that be considered a cool shadow?
Yeah, yeah. Depending on how much blue or red you're using too. I'd say it's more on the bluer side right now, but here where I pushed that cad red, it's more of a warmer violet.
That alizarin crimson you said once is kind of cool, even though it's warm. And
Yeah,
it's
yes.
red, so it's a warm, but it's of the reds, it's cool.
Yeah,
Saying there,
yeah.
right?
It's all context. It depends on what it's going up next to. One thing that alizarin crimson is we can be sure of is it's dark and powerful. So I'll let those sharper ones dry, and I can go back and revisit the features of the face. The shadows on the face are all very warm, so I'm going to clean off my palette.
It's really good. You'd already see the likeness.
I think the likeness is okay. I think something about the chin got too big, which is like affecting how we're seeing the jawline, the space under the jawline. I know the wetsuit's kind of covering that and covering some like crucial landmarks near the collarbones, but still it's something's a little off there, so I might have to either revisit that later or just be aware of it going into the next
I
larger.
love your technique of doing the shadowing first because it really brings out the facial features, it seems.
Thanks. Yeah, it's just it's like an extension of drawing, really. That's what we do when we draw. And it's just we're making a white piece of paper darker.
Yeah.
So the shadows are just so important. Okay, I'm gonna grab some. I feel like going up from here, there's like a very smooth but subtle transition, then up into the brow there. It's dark and warm. I'm gonna grab some yellow ochre and some red. Yellow ochre and red is that like darkness it'll get is it's like a dark orange. It's almost brown, but I see it as being a little bit more saturated than just straight up burnt sienna. Because we could say burnt sienna is like a good go-to
Use yellow ochre and what color?
cadmium red.
Ah,
And then as we go up this cheek here, it swings a little bit more red. I'm gonna grab some of the quinacridone magenta and maybe some cad red for that. So those are like our two different things happening here. And I'm gonna try and blend them going up towards the eye, but it also gets a lot lighter too. So we want to think about value, edge, and temperature all at once. We're like in the light shape right here. We're on the side of his face that's catching some light. So we want to be pretty careful about it. Taking this whole form and kind of like tucking it into that cast shadow above the mouth there. So you can see it started out a little more brown, and then as I made my way up, lighter and not necessarily cooler, just more towards red. I always think of the warm colors as being like the warmest color being orange. So you could lean that orange towards yellow or red. It kind of starts out darker and more yellow and then gets lighter and more red as it goes up. And then we kind of arrive back at a similar color for this shadow of the brow here. And then the left side of the face is darker and a little bit cooler. So maybe on this magenta side, I might add a little, very, very small amount of ultramarine and then more alizarin crimson. That's going to darken it a ton. My son's daycare is on spring break this week, which I just found out last week that we're going to be spending the week with our 2-year-old while we're working or while I'm working. But I hear his friend from school just arrived. So there's multiple 2-year-olds in the house right now, ripping it apart. So I'm going to really hold on tight to our last few minutes of class here and enjoy our painting. Down here under the nose, the facial hair goes kind of almost kind of green. Not like actually green, but again, in relation to all the other shadows on the face, I'm thinking of it as being darker and cooler. So I'm adding a little bit of blue and a little bit of yellow ochre to that violet that we just had, which is just giving me like a dark grayish cooler color. Let's see where this goes. I want to say more yellow ochre because of the just that local color of the mustache. Maybe I should have waited for everything else to dry. I'm gonna go back to that warmer shadow from the beginning. It was what did we say? Yellow ochre and cad red. Down here at the mustache, the mouth, all kind of combined into one shared shadow there. And this too kind of cools off, gets a little bit darker as we move towards the left. Again, there's that little piece of, remember that, let me share my screen. That piece of the mouth, not that one. We talked about these spheres kind of beneath the bottom lip, but kind of off in the corner. That right there, that little light shape is catching some light. So that's going to be of a similar value to the skin tone up here, which might be too light right now. but I want to keep that in mind. I want to preserve that little shape. I don't want to just totally obliterate that just yet. So just be aware of that. Little bit of a shadow here. There's that downward plane. Whoops, that's too much water. That downward facing plane beneath that bottom lip is casting a shadow just sort of on the left side. So I'll let that sit for a little bit longer. Overall, the face is really light right now. If I could just let this sit for a while, I would maybe, I can either go over it with a transparent wash after this to push the values darker even within the light shapes, or I can just know for the larger version, like, especially when we paint the large version, I'm going to have this right there next to me as a reminder for how this all went. And I'm going to know I can push that first wash we did a little bit darker. For now, I'll let those dry and I'll jump back to the wetsuit side of things. So here I'm grabbing ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, and alizarin crimson all at once, just to make like a muddy, dark gray. If we mix all our primaries colors together, we get a gray. I want to try to rebuild this. Maybe I should lift some of this out first. Whatever's going on with the chin here. So lifting it out and then going right back into it, I want to make sure it's nice and dry. I don't want to flood it with water and then try to paint it. I think this line being more vertical, maybe that's part of what that needed. Sometimes when you're painting a portraits especially, I mean, something will look off and you'll try to fix it, really focus in, add more detail, maybe just dig in deeper and it just gets kind of worse, or you feel like you're spinning your wheels and not really making any real progress. Sometimes it's not that thing at all, but something next to it. So if something feels weird about the mouth, it might be part of the shoulder that's off. So what's important is that you keep backing up. If you need to walk around and look at something different for a minute, you can do that. But being aware of the big picture is so crucial. It's less about what each feature of the face looks like and more about how they all fit together and the relationships between them. So I like this shadow under the chin. Starts out sharper over here and just kind of loses its edge as it goes further up. So I'm just adding some water and letting this kind of roll a little bit smoother. So like darker and sharp over here, and then kind of getting softer and smoother as it moves up and away and towards the light. And that too, we talked about during the landscape paintings, trying to have different kinds of edges in the painting, varying your edge quality can really bring a painting to life. This too, I want to let this dry. Oh, we only have a couple minutes left. Darn. That always happens. All right. So I don't know. Let's see what happens. I want this to dry a little bit. I think my own critique of the painting in front of me here, I wish everything on the figure was a little bit darker. When I squint and look at the reference, there's a pretty stark difference of like the figure and the background are pretty different values. The light, or sorry, the face is pretty light still, but the wetsuit, like the weight of it, just visually, I think it'd be more impactful if the whole thing was just stronger. So that's something I want to keep in mind for when I do my larger piece. Um, and I think the skin tones could have a little bit more life in them too. So if you're following along with me, just think about, what could be improved in this, and then how can we use that information to guide us through the larger painting. And I'll take a look next week too at what everyone has. What I'd like you to do is work on this study and prepare like a larger drawing for your, like on your bigger watercolor paper for this portrait we're gonna work on in class next week. I'm excited to spend more time on that and really get that thing to like a nice finish. I'm gonna let this dry just for a minute. Because yeah, I would like to just push the whole wetsuit darker. I'm gonna walk away just for a minute here. I'll be right back. I'm gonna run inside. almost dry there. The face is dry, so maybe we can push that a little bit before we're done here today. I think I could have made the face a little bit rounder too. The wetsuits just kind of like pull your face in a funny way. And I think I could have rounded that out a little bit. So I want to push some of those light shapes a little bit darker. So I'm mixing some cad red, cad yellow, and a tiny bit of alizarin crimson, but mostly water. And I want to get into, I didn't really paint much into like the light shape here of the face. So I think just adding a tone to all of that. This could ruin it. So maybe wait a second if you're following along. Watch me ruin my painting first. But just a little bit of a tone to the whole thing. I think that went okay. Which then gives me room to push the shadows darker too. So once that dries, I can push the shadows darker. No, I might do a similar thing to the wetsuit. I'm getting some alizarin crimson, some ultramarine blue, and some burnt sienna just to make this really dark. And some yellow ochre too. And I'm just putting a transparent layer over the whole thing. This will destroy some of what I have on here. But again, I think from the big picture, looking at the big picture, I think it's important to get this whole wetsuit a little bit darker, just like we got the whole face a little bit darker and more saturated. So don't be shy. That's what these little studies are for. Test stuff out. I think that helped the whole painting quite a bit. And now I can go in and once this is dry,
That was alizarin crimson and ultramarine.
yeah, with some burnt sienna and a little bit of yellow ochre too.
Wow. It's kind yeah, it came out nice.
Thank you.
It's like kind of a reddish gray, would you say?
Yeah, kind of like a dull, muddy gray. Um, it has a lot of blue in it, but I was hoping the yellow kind of balanced out some of the violet from the alizarin too. So I don't know. And I mean, it picked up a lot of what was there too. Same thing happened in the face. Like we used a lot of the same colors, but we activated a lot of the pigments that were already there, which helps keep it cohesive too. But we'll let this dry. If you're sharpening a pencil, oh, my voice just cracked. If you're sharpening a pencil with a razor blade and sanding it with the drywall screen, um, don't do it over a nice rug and don't have like nice clothes on. You're gonna make a mess. It's gonna be dirty. And you might break some pencils too. Don't get frustrated. The more you practice that, the easier it gets. I think I have a video of sharpening pencils, so I can post that too. If that's something you're interested in. Okay, I think kind of dry in there. Going right up to the end of class here, but let's see if I can push some of these shadows in the face. I'm trying to remember what we had before. It was yellow ochre and cad red for the warmer one. Especially towards the edge of this shadow, the yellow ochre is pretty strong. And I think, I mean, it goes without saying, but I shouldn't say that. I'll say it anyway. Um, I'm being very careful when I go into these features of the face, being really thoughtful about exactly where the paint is going. Trying to be as aware as I can of where the brush itself is going, like what the brush stroke is doing. So not in like a self-conscious way. I don't, is there a difference between self-conscious and self-aware? Maybe it's just semantics, but being really thoughtful about exactly where the brush is going here. The kinds of marks I'm making and how to make them, the kind of brush I'm using, the direction of the brush stroke. It can be fast and loose with the landscapes we did, or it can be really slow and methodical and tight, like this portrait.
Really intentional.
That's a good word. Yeah, intentional. I think you can be intentional without being robotic, if that makes sense. I'm going to mix a cooler face shadow here. What did we use last time? Some either quinacridone or alizarin, and a little bit of blue, like a very small amount of blue. And then I'll grab some of that warmer color from a minute ago. Let me zoom out so you can see my palette. So these are each a shadow color. One is cooler, one is warmer. This one's more red, this one's more yellow. The yellow is kind of leaning more orange. The red is leaning more violet. So just, I kind of always have that color wheel in the back of my head.
For the cool shadows, what you said ultramarine and alizarin crisp and crimson.
Yeah, just a tiny bit of ultramarine. We don't want it too blue on the face, just because faces are generally pretty warm. And this guy, like myself, is pasty white and then lots of sunburn. So not a whole lot of blue in the face. And I used quinacridone and alizarin. One of them is probably fine on its own. They're doing pretty similar things here. I feel like the quinacridone magenta pushes it just a little bit further towards blue as well. And I like that. and it kind of pushes the saturation like maybe a little bit past reality, but I've just grown to like that color. So after all we've talked about today, sometimes you just like a color and you just
Yeah.
make it more intense. That's that's okay. That's what the paint is for. Don't let anyone tell you you're not allowed to do that, even if it's me. One thing I forgot about kind of here is pushing this. There's like a redness in the light shape on that cheek there. I'm gonna grab some cad red. I'm gonna dry off my brush a tiny bit because I don't want to activate. I just put in those shadows really carefully. I definitely don't want to activate that, but just as that turns light towards the dark there, there's that little bit of that skin tone. Goes a little bit more red. So I would consider this sort of like set up for another hour of just being very slow and methodical in the face there. Or we could say another hour of just ruining this nice painting. Think what happens.
Shane, you said quinacridine, did you say?
Quinacridone magenta
Oh,
is I'll hold it up right here.
okay.
Took me like a year to say that right.
Quinacridone, okay.
I was mispronouncing it in class for probably a year, and I said it a little different each time too. Just I think I'm saying it the right way now. I don't
So
think
it's ultimate, you're for the cooler shadows, you're using ultramarine, alizarin crimson, and the magenta? Does that make
yeah. The magenta is close to alizarin crimson,
uh,
and they make a quinacridone red. Uh, there's a couple of those. I like the quinacridone magenta because it's a little bit more of like a cool pink. If you look on here, this is alizarin crimson, this is quinacridone magenta, and where it is on my palette, if I zoom out, you can see it's like kind of completing the color wheel in a way, on its way to blue over here. We're like, this is alizarin crimson, there's cad red right here. That's burnt sienna, so this is getting warmer, and then this is getting cooler. So I feel like the magenta, that's kind of its job, is completing the circle, so to speak.
I see. That's